Mara Osei was smiling when they found her. That detail would confuse the rescue team for weeks afterward. Her shuttle's hull was cracked open like an egg dropped on stone. Her heater had failed 6 hours before anyone reached her. Frost had crept across the inside of her visor in thin, branching lines, like something growing. By every reading on her suit, she should have been unconscious. Maybe worse. Instead, when the light finally hit her face, her mouth was curved at the corners, calm and small, the way a person smiles when they've just remembered something good. No one understood it yet. Not even her. 3 days before that, Mara had been doing the most boring job in the galaxy, and she loved it for exactly that reason. She surveyed empty rock for a living. Her shuttle, the Fielder, drifted through a stretch of space called the Rift Belt, cataloging minerals no company would bother mining for a decade, maybe 2. It was slow work. It was quiet work. Most people who signed up for survey routes lasted 6 months before the silence got to them and they asked to be reassigned somewhere with other voices in it. Mara had been doing it for 4 years. She had grown up on a small farm in a part of Earth that still smelled like rain and cut grass most mornings. Her mother grew vegetables in rows so straight you could set a level against them. Her father could fix anything with a coil of wire and enough patience, an old tractor, a busted water pump, a child's broken heart. Between the two of them, Mara had learned 2 lessons early and learned them well. Growing things takes time you cannot rush. And most problems, given enough patience, can be solved with your own 2 hands. When Earth's survey program put out a call for volunteers willing to work alone in deep space for months at a stretch, most applicants treated the isolation as the price of the job. Mara treated it as the reason to apply. "You really don't mind the quiet?" her supervisor had asked, flipping through her file with a slightly worried look, the kind reserved for people who seemed a little too eager for solitude. "I don't mind being enough," Mara had said. "Out there, it's just me and the work. I like knowing I don't need anything more than that to get through a day." She carried one strange thing with her on every single trip, tucked inside her jacket where it rode against her ribs like a second heartbeat. A small cloth pouch of seeds. Beans, mostly, because beans were forgiving and grew fast. A few sunflower seeds, because her mother always kept sunflowers along the fence line, tall and stubborn, turning their faces toward whatever light was available. The storm came without warning, the way the worst ones always did. Dust storms were common enough in the Rift Belt, background noise on every survey log. This one carried something heavier at its center, a fist of ice and torn metal, the leftovers of some collision no one had ever logged or explained. It hit the Fielder broadside, and for 3 full seconds Mara simply sat frozen in her chair, ears ringing, watching sparks rain down from a control panel that had worked perfectly an hour before. Then her hands started moving faster than her fear could catch up to. Years of drills took over. She sealed what she could seal. She vented what she couldn't save. She strapped herself into the survival pod built into the floor of the cockpit, the one she checked every week and hoped, every single time, she would never actually need. The power died soon after that, and the cold came in like water filling a boot, slow at first, then all at once. She had time to think, in that long, stretched, quiet way that only happens when a person is entirely alone with a problem too large to solve by hand. She thought about her parents' kitchen, the smell of coffee and turned soil that never fully left the walls. She thought about dirt under her fingernails, about long summer evenings spent walking rows of beans with her mother, checking each plant like it was a small, patient friend. She thought, with something close to wonder, about how strange it was that a handful of seeds pressed against her ribs felt like the single most important thing she owned, more important than the shuttle, more important than the mission logs, more important than almost anything except her own 2 hands. She did not think about anyone coming to save her. Out here, in the Rift Belt, there was no one close enough to hear a distress call, let alone answer one in time. That should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, in the last clear minutes before the cold began to blur her thoughts at the edges, Mara found herself doing something she hadn't planned and couldn't fully explain. She began, very quietly, to hum an old song her mother used to sing while weeding the garden, something tuneless and half-remembered, more rhythm than melody. It kept her hands steady. It kept her mind from spinning loose. That was when the light hit her shuttle. Not a rescue beacon. Not a human ship. Not by any signature her instruments recognized. A working light, dim and orange, sweeping slow and methodical across the wreck, the way a person checks a fence line after a storm, looking for damage, not for treasure. Mara turned her head, barely, everything in her suit stiff with cold, and saw a shape outside her cracked window. Tall, thin, wrapped in patched fabric the color of rust and old iron. 2 long arms folded loosely across a narrow chest, and where a face should have been, a smooth plate that caught the orange light like still water. She did not know if it meant to help her or take her apart for salvage. She smiled anyway, because there was nothing left to do but wait and see what came next, and because some small, stubborn part of her had already decided, long before this moment, that whatever happened, she would meet it standing on her own feet, in her own mind, still entirely herself. The shape outside raised one long hand, slow and careful, the universal shape of "I am not here to hurt you." Mara raised her own hand back, the best she could manage inside a glove already gone stiff with cold. The last thing she remembered before the dark finally took a hold was the shape working patiently at her door, unhurried, careful, letting her in like a farmer opening a gate for something wounded and worth saving. She woke to warmth first, then to sound, a low mechanical hum, steady as a heartbeat, threading through the walls around her. The room was small and round, lit by soft green strips running along the seams of the walls like veins under skin. The air carried the smell of old metal and something green and growing underneath it, faint but unmistakably real, the kind of smell Mara hadn't expected to find this far from any working farm. She lay on a woven mat, wrapped in fabric that had clearly been patched and re-patched by careful, practiced hands, dozens of small stitches crossing dozens of old tears. She sat up too fast, and the room swam. "Slow," a voice said. It came through a small device clipped near her ear, translating a half beat behind the real sound, so every word arrived twice, first as a soft, clicking rhythm and then in careful, faintly accented English. "You are safe. You are aboard the hollow bell." The speaker stood near the door, still as a held breath. Tall, thin, wrapped in the same rust and iron fabric Mara remembered from the wreck. Up close, she could finally see the shape clearly. Long limbs built for gripping and climbing, more bird than mammal in their proportions. A narrow head with 2 dark, deep-set eyes and a mouth that barely moved when it spoke. Feathers, she realized, not fur, not scales, fine and grey along the neck and shoulders, worn thin in places with age. "You found me," Mara said. Her voice came out cracked, rusty from disuse. "Onai found you," the alien said. "I only carried you the rest of the way. I am Kesh." Kesh did not sit. Kesh did not smile, though Mara suspected the face wasn't built for it at all. There was a stillness to the posture that felt less like caution and more like judgment being carefully, deliberately withheld, the way a person holds their opinion of a stranger until there's proof enough to spend it on. "Where is Onai?" Mara asked. "Outside. Young ones are not permitted near strangers until the strangers are known." Kesh tilted their head slightly, a small, precise motion. "You are not known yet." Mara understood that logic well enough. She had grown up around farm dogs that worked the exact same way, sniffing first, trusting only after. "Thank you for pulling me out," she said. "I mean that. Truly." "You are welcome. And you are a problem," Kesh said, without any apparent malice, simply stating both facts in the same even breath. "The hollow bell has little food, less air, and no room for guests we did not choose. We debated leaving you where we found you." "Why didn't you?" For the first time, something shifted behind Kesh's stillness. Not warmth, not exactly. Curiosity, maybe, sharp and careful. "Because you were alone out there, and you were not afraid the way most are afraid when they are alone," Kesh said. "We wanted to understand why." Mara thought of the smile the rescue team would later find so strange, though of course she had no way of knowing about that yet. She only knew the truth of it from the inside. "I wasn't afraid of being alone," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. "I was afraid of dying. Those aren't the same fear. I've been alone plenty of times in my life and never once felt like I was less than whole because of it." Kesh studied her for a long, silent moment, the fine feathers along the neck lifting slightly, a gesture Mara couldn't yet read but would come to recognize, in time, as something close to being moved. "On this ship," Kesh finally said, "that is not a small difference to notice. It may be the largest difference there is." Before Mara could ask what that meant, a smaller face appeared in the doorway, peeking around Kesh's arm with all the subtlety of a child who has never once succeeded at being subtle. Smaller than Kesh, feathers brighter, gold at the edges, eyes too big for a narrow face still soft with youth. "She's awake," Onai said, delighted, forgetting entirely to be cautious the way she'd clearly been told to be. "Kesh, she's awake, can I please?" "Onai," Kesh said, a warning wrapped carefully around a single word. Onai ducked back out of sight, but not before Mara caught the shape of something that had to be a grin, whatever passed for one on a face built so differently from her own. Mara laughed despite everything, a small, crack sound, the first real laugh she'd managed since the storm hit her shuttle. Kesh watched her laugh the way someone watches whether they don't yet trust, uncertain if it means calm skies or worse still coming. "Rest," Kesh said finally. "Tomorrow you will meet the rest of the clan. Not all of them will be as pleased to find you as Onai clearly is." That night, alone in the small round room, Mara lay listening to the unfamiliar hum of a ship not built by human hands, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was not afraid. Curious, yes. Careful, certainly. But not afraid. Whatever waited for her among strangers this far from home, she still had her own 2 hands, her own steady mind, and a small pouch of seeds pressed warm against her ribs. It was, she thought, enough to start with. The Hollow Bell was not a ship built for beauty, but Mara found herself charmed by it anyway, the way she'd once been charmed by an old, half-collapsed barn on a neighboring farm, more history than structure, but somehow more honest for it. It had once been something far larger, an ark of some kind, built to carry thousands across long, uncertain distances. Most of it lay dark now, sealed off behind pressure doors that hadn't opened in decades, systems too old and too broken to run. The Ashvane clan lived in the surviving third, a warren of patched corridors and repurposed rooms strung through with wiring like ivy climbing an old wall. Every surface bore the marks of careful, constant repair. Nothing here was new. Everything here was kept, mended, made to last one more season past its natural end. Kesh walked her through it slowly the next morning, explaining what needed no explaining and staying carefully quiet on what clearly did. "You were part of something bigger once," Mara guessed, watching how the corridors had been built for far more people than she'd seen aboard so far, wide enough for crowds that no longer existed. Kesh's steps slowed, feathers pressing flatter against the narrow shoulders. "We were part of the lattice." The word came out careful, weighted, the way a person says the name of someone they've lost and still aren't finished grieving. "The lattice was a joined mind," Kesh said. "Thousands of us, connected, sharing thought the way your kind shares breath, without needing to ask. No Ashvane was ever truly alone, not for a single moment of a single day. The lattice decided, and we followed, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything we understood ourselves to be." "What happened to it?" "It broke," Kesh said simply. 40 years ago. No warning we ever found. No cause anyone has ever explained to my satisfaction. One moment we were one mind wearing 1,000 bodies. The next, we were 1,000 minds, each one alone for the very first time in its life, each one screaming into a silence it did not know how to survive. Mara said nothing for a while. She had no framework of her own for a loss that size. She only understood, from the way Kesh's voice had gone thin and careful, that it was enormous, and that words could only reach so far around the edges of it. "Many died," Kesh continued, quieter now. "Not from injury. From the absence itself. Some minds simply could not hold their own shape without the lattice around them, the way a fish cannot hold its shape outside water. Those of us who survived built this." A gesture, slow and tired, taking in the corridor, the patched wires, the whole small, stubborn, breathing world of the Hollow Bell. "We are still learning, all these years later, how to be one person at a time. Some of us have learned it well. Others have not learned it at all." They reached a wide room that had clearly once served some grander purpose, its high ceiling still ringed with the sockets of long-dead lighting fixtures, big enough to seat a crowd 10 times the size of the one gathered there now. It served, today, as a common space, warmed by a scatter of the same green light strips Mara had woken to. A dozen Ashvane were gathered there, sorting food stores, mending fabric, murmuring in low, clicking conversation that stopped, almost as one motion, the moment Mara stepped through the doorway. Mara felt the full weight of it, a dozen unreadable faces turning at once, a dozen postures she had no practice reading. She kept her spine straight and her hands loose and open at her sides, the way her father had once taught her to stand in front of nervous, unfamiliar livestock, no sudden movement, no fear held tight enough to be smelled. One of the gathered Ashvane stepped forward, separating himself from the rest with the easy authority of someone long used to being listened to. Older than Kesh, feathers gone nearly white at the edges, eyes sharp as broken glass. "This is Draith," Kesh said quietly, close to Mara's ear. "He leads those among us who still believe the lattice can be rebuilt, whatever the cost of trying." Draith did not offer a greeting. He circled Mara once, slow and deliberate, studying her the way a buyer studies a horse he hasn't yet decided is worth the asking price. "She survived alone," Draith said at last, not to Mara, but to the room at large, his voice carrying easily across the wide space.
No lattice. No clan.
No voice in her skull but her own, and she did not break. Look at her. She stands as steady as any of us ever stood inside the lattice's embrace. "She is human," Kesh said evenly. "Perhaps humans are simply built to stand that way, alone or not." "Or perhaps," Draith said, turning his sharp eyes fully onto Mara for the first time, "she is something far rarer than that. An unbound one. We have not seen a true unbound one since the lattice fell and left the rest of us broken in its place." Mara didn't understand the term yet, but she understood the look on Draith's face well enough. It was the same look she'd once seen on a corporate scout eyeing a promising mineral field, weighing not what something was, but what it could be made to yield. "I'm just a surveyor," she said carefully, keeping her voice even. "I got caught in a bad storm, and your clan was kind enough to pull me out of it. That's the whole story. There's no mystery hiding underneath it." Draith's feathers lifted, sharp and quick, a motion Mara would later learn meant something between disbelief and hunger. "That," he said softly, "is exactly what an unbound one would say, whether she understood the words or not." He turned and walked away without another word, and the room slowly followed his lead, drifting back to their tasks, until only Kesh and Onai remained standing near Mara in the wide, half-lit space. What did he mean? Mara asked, watching Draith's retreating back. "Unbound one. It sounds like more than just a word to him." Kesh's silence lasted long enough that Mara understood, before any answer came, that whatever it meant, it mattered more than the word itself led on. "It means trouble," Kesh finally said. "For you, and, I suspect, for all of us before this is finished." Kesh led her onward after that, past the common room and deeper into the clan's living quarters, a maze of small chambers separated by curtains rather than doors, each one marked with a different woven pattern that Mara slowly realized functioned like a name. Children's laughter drifted from somewhere ahead, quickly hushed by an older voice, and Mara caught glimpses of daily life continuing in careful, quiet rhythm around her. An elderly Ashvane repairing a torn sleeping mat with slow, patient stitches. Two younger clan members sorting dried ration packets into careful piles, murmuring to each other in the clicking rhythm of their own language. A child no older than Onai practicing what looked like careful, deliberate breathing exercises alone in a corner, eyes closed, feathers occasionally trembling with effort. "What is she doing?" Mara asked quietly, nodding toward the child. "Learning to hold her own thoughts steady, without another mind nearby to lean on," Kesh said. "It is taught now, formally, to every child born after the fall. A skill none of us needed to learn deliberately, before. It came to us as naturally as breathing itself, back when the lattice still held us all together." "That sounds exhausting," Mara said, watching the child's small, determined face. "It is, at first," Kesh agreed. "For you, I suspect, it would seem like nothing at all. A skill so basic to your kind you have never once needed to name it, let alone practice it deliberately in a corner, alone, hoping to get it right." There was no bitterness in Kesh's voice as they said this, only a kind of tired, honest wonder. "That is, I think, precisely why Draith fears you as much as he is drawn to you. You make something look effortless that has cost us 4 decades of grief to even begin to learn." They passed the garden bay on the way back, and Mara paused at the doorway, drawn by the faint green smell drifting out into the corridor. Rows of pale, struggling plants stretched under weak overhead light, tended with obvious care despite their poor condition, small handwritten labels marking each row in a script Mara couldn't read but recognized instantly as the universal shorthand of someone keeping careful track of what needed watching. "This was meant to feed thousands," Kesh said, following her gaze. "Now it barely feeds dozens, and even that some seasons. We have never quite gotten the balance right, the light, the water, the soil mixture. Every year we lose a little more of what we managed to grow than the year before." Mara knelt beside the nearest row without asking permission, running her fingers gently along a wilting stalk, reading its shape and color the way she might read a familiar sentence. "Overwatered," she said after a moment, "and starved for the right wavelength of light at the same time. It's not a hopeless problem. It's just two small problems stacked on top of each other, pretending to be one big one. Kesh watched her with an expression that had, for the first time since they'd met, lost nearly all of its careful reserve. You say that as though it was simple. Most things are, once you separate out what's actually wrong, Mara said, standing and brushing soil from her knees. The hard part is usually just being patient enough to look closely before deciding what to fix first. Over the days that followed, Mara learned the hollow bell the same way she'd once learned an unfamiliar field back home, by walking it slowly, touching what needed fixing, listening for what it was quietly asking for. The water reclaimers ran ragged, clogged with decades of patched filters no one had the spare parts to properly replace. The garden bay, once built to feed thousands, now grew only a thin, struggling scatter of pale plants under failing light strips that flickered more than they should. The clan ate carefully, rationed down to the gram, tired in a way that had settled deep into their bones over 4 decades of quiet, grinding survival. Onai followed her nearly everywhere she was permitted to go, which was most places now, having appointed herself Mara's guide whether Kesh fully approved of the arrangement or not. You keep touching things like you're greeting them, Onai observed one afternoon, watching Mara run careful fingers along a corroded pipe joint in the garden bay, testing, listening, the way her father once tested an old engine before deciding what it truly needed. I'm listening to them, Mara said. Machines talk, if you pay attention. So do plants, in their own quiet way. Plants don't talk, Onai said, tilting her head, clearly certain of this. Not with words. Mara knelt beside one of the struggling seedlings, a pale, leggy thing straining sideways toward light that wasn't quite strong enough to satisfy it. But look how it's leaning, reaching that direction instead of growing straight up. That's it telling you it needs more light, or maybe better soil underneath it. You just have to know how to listen for that kind of talking. Onai crouched down beside her, feathers puffed with genuine interest. Can you fix it? I can help it fix itself, Mara said. That's most of what growing things really is, if you think about it. Not doing the work for something, but giving it what it needs so it can do the work on its own. She reached into her jacket then and drew out the small cloth pouch she'd carried since Earth, the one she hadn't shown anyone aboard the Hollow Bell yet. She wasn't entirely sure why she chose that particular moment to share it, except that Onai's eyes were bright and open and entirely honest, and honesty, Mara had always believed, deserved honesty in return. What is that? Onai asked, leaning closer. Seeds, Mara said. Beans, mostly. I carry them everywhere I go. It's a habit from home, from my family. Why carry something so small so far? Mara turned the pouch over in her hands, feeling the small, hard shapes shift inside it, each one a whole plant waiting patiently for its chance. Because no matter where I end up, she said slowly, I want to be able to grow something. Even if I end up somewhere I never expected. Even if I'm the only one there to grow it, and nobody's watching to see whether I succeed. It doesn't need permission from anyone else. It doesn't need someone standing over it approving each step. It just needs dirt, and water, and enough patience to wait and see what happens. Onai was quiet for a long moment, turning that idea over slowly, the way a person turns over a stone looking for what might be underneath it. Kesh says humans don't need the lattice, or anything like it, Onai said finally. That you're already whole, even completely alone. Is that really true, or is Kesh only hoping it's true? Mara thought about the frozen shuttle, the smile the rescue team would later find so strange, though of course neither of them knew about that part of the story yet. She thought about her parents' kitchen, and every quiet, unhurried season spent working the fields, and how none of it had ever once felt like waiting to become something more finished than she already was. I think, Mara said carefully, that being whole and being alone aren't really opposites, even though a lot of people assume they must be. I was scared out there, in the storm. I've been lonely plenty of times too, on long survey routes with no one to talk to for months at a stretch. But scared and lonely aren't the same thing as broken. I was still completely me the whole time, even at my most frightened. That's what being human feels like, I think. You're always still you, whether or not anyone else is around to remind you of it. Onai looked down at the small seed still resting in her open palm, and then, carefully, closed her fingers around it, the way a person closes their hand around something they've quietly decided to believe in. Will you teach me? Onai asked. How to grow something, even alone, without anyone telling me exactly how. Especially alone, Mara said, and pressed a second seed into the girl's palm for good measure. Promise me you'll plant it somewhere. Doesn't matter where. Doesn't matter if anyone else believes it'll grow, or thinks it's worth the effort. You just do it anyway, and you watch, and you wait, and you trust it. I promise, Onai said solemnly, closing her fingers tighter around the seeds like something precious and fragile. Neither of them noticed Draith standing near the far doorway, half in shadow, watching, his sharp eyes moving slowly from the seeds cupped in Onai's small hand to the pouch still resting in Mara's palm, weighing something in his mind that neither of them could yet begin to guess. The clan gathering happened 3 days later, called by Draith in the wide common room, and this time Mara was summoned along with everyone else, a formal request delivered by a clan member she didn't recognize, his tone polite but his posture stiff with something like unease. She stood near Kesh, arms folded, trying to read the room the way she'd once learned to read a barn full of restless animals before a coming storm. Something was gathering here. She could feel it in the tight, careful postures, the low murmured conversations, the way no one in the room would quite meet her eyes directly. Draith stood at the center of the space, feathers raised in a way Mara now understood signaled conviction rather than calm. The water reclaimers hold steady for now, Draith began, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the wide room, because the human fixed what our own hands, working together for 40 years, never could. Some among you call that a gift. I call it a warning worth taking seriously. Murmurs rippled outward through the gathered clan, a dozen small conversations breaking out and falling silent again. For 40 years, Draith continued, we have lived as scattered pieces, each of us alone inside our own skull, grieving a mind we no longer share and may never share again. We have called this survival, and told ourselves it was enough simply to endure. I call it a slow death dressed carefully up as patience. He turned then, and his sharp eyes found Mara across the room without hesitation. And then an unbound one falls out of the sky above us and mends what we could not, without visible effort, without asking permission from a single soul aboard this ship, without even fully understanding what she has actually done. I only fixed a filter, Mara said quietly, though her voice carried further than she'd intended in the sudden hush. You fixed a filter alone, Draith said, without hesitation, without needing anyone else's permission or presence to guide your hands. Do you understand what that means to people like us? We have not seen a mind function that completely alone, that completely whole, since long before the lattice broke apart. You are living proof that it is possible. Proof of what, exactly? Kesh asked, voice carefully controlled, though Mara could feel the tension coiled tight beneath it. Proof that binding itself can be rebuilt, Draith said, turning back to address the wider room now, his voice rising with conviction. I believe the fracture in the lattice can be repaired, if we finally understand what made a single mind whole enough to survive that kind of break unbroken. I believe she is the key we have been searching for since the day it fell. I propose we study her carefully. Learn precisely what makes her complete. Use that understanding to bind ourselves back together, stronger and more certain than we ever were before. The wide room went very still, every eye turning, one after another, toward Mara. Study her, Kesh repeated slowly, each word deliberate. You mean take her apart, in some fashion, to see how she works underneath. I mean save our people, Draith said, an edge of real desperation cutting through his composure for the first time. 40 years of grief is enough, Kesh. I will not simply watch another season pass while we starve quietly in this broken shell of a ship, calling our suffering dignity because the alternative feels too frightening to attempt. Mara felt something cold settle low in her stomach, the particular fear of being looked at as a resource rather than a person. She had felt an echo of it once before, briefly, on an early survey contract, when a corporate scout had valued her only for what she could extract from a promising planet, never once for anything she carried inside herself beyond her usefulness. I'm not a key, she said, and made herself say it clearly, steadily, without letting her voice shake. I'm not a missing piece of your lattice, waiting to be fitted back into place. I don't have some secret binding trick hidden inside me that your scientists could extract given enough time. I'm just a person who learned a long time ago that being alone doesn't have to mean being empty. Easy words to say, Draith replied, for someone whose kind never lost what we lost. You cannot know the shape of an absence you've never carried. Maybe not, Mara said, but that doesn't make what I'm telling you any less true. Draith studied her for a long, silent moment, and something in his sharp eyes shifted, not softening exactly, but sharpening further, the look of a man quietly deciding that a harder path had become necessary, whatever the cost of walking it. "The council will consider my proposal formally," Draith said finally, turning back to address the wider room. "In the meantime, the human remains under close watch. For her own safety," he added, in a tone that made unmistakably clear whose safety he truly meant, "and for the safety of everyone aboard this ship." The gathering broke apart slowly into uneasy clusters of murmured conversation. Kesh guided Mara away before Draith could approach her directly, feathers pressed flat with something Mara was beginning to recognize, more and more clearly, as genuine worry. "That went poorly," Kesh said quietly, once they were alone together in the corridor. "He wants to use me," Mara said. "Like a tool. Like a resource, not a person." "He wants to save his people," Kesh said, sighing. "The tragedy of it is that those two things are not always different to a man desperate enough, and grieving enough, to stop seeing the line between them clearly." They walked in silence for a while, past sealed doors and quiet, sleeping corridors, before Kesh spoke again. "Draith was not always like this," Kesh said. "Before the fall, he was one of the calmest minds in the whole lattice. Others came to him with disputes, and he settled them fairly, without ever needing to raise his voice. When the break happened, he lost more than the rest of us, in a way. He lost the version of himself that knew, without doubt, exactly what to do with his days. And now he doesn't know who he is without it," Mara said quietly. "Now he believes the only way to know who he is again is to become part of something larger than himself once more," Kesh said. "He cannot yet imagine that a person might be complete on their own terms. You threaten that belief simply by existing calmly in front of him. That is a dangerous thing to threaten in a grieving man." Mara thought about that for a long time after Kesh left her at her door that night. She thought about how fear rarely announced itself honestly. It usually wore the mask of certainty instead, the way Draith's grief had dressed itself up as conviction, the way her own fear, on the frozen shuttle, had dressed itself up as calm. Maybe those were closer cousins than most people like to admit. For a while, against Mara's better instincts, it seemed the danger might simply pass on its own, worn down by ordinary time and ordinary work. The water reclaimers held steady. The garden bay, tended now by both Mara and Onai every free hour they could find, began to show real green among the pale, struggling stalks that had lined its rows for years. Small, ordinary miracles, exactly the kind Mara had built her entire life around, and for a handful of days, the clan's overall mood seemed to lift right alongside them, tension easing from shoulders that had carried it for years. Even Kesh softened, in small, careful ways that felt significant precisely because they were so restrained. They began sharing evening meals together in a quiet corner of the common room, Mara teaching Onai simple recipes built from whatever the Hollowbell could actually provide, thin broths made rich with careful seasoning, flatbreads cooked on scavenged metal. Kesh listened more than spoke during these meals, feathers settling gradually into something closer to genuine ease than Mara had yet seen. "You remind me of something we lost," Kesh admitted one evening, watching Mara coax a stubborn irrigation valve back to life using nothing but patience and a short length of scavenged wire. "Before the lattice, long before any of this, my grandmother's grandmother lived as a single mind, entirely alone, the way your kind lives now, every day of your lives. The old stories say it was harder then. Lonelier, certainly. But also," Kesh paused, choosing the next word with visible care, "more honest, somehow, in a way I am only beginning to understand. Every choice belonged entirely and only to the one who made it. No one else could claim a share of it, and no one else could be blamed for it either." "That sounds like a fair trade to me," Mara said, working the valve free at last with a satisfying click. "Harder, but honest. I'd take that most days." Draith would disagree strongly. "Draith is scared," Mara said, not unkindly, wiping grease from her hands onto an old rag. "I've met a lot of scared people in my life, back home and out here both. Scared people build cages, more often than not, and then convince themselves the cages are really solutions." Kesh didn't answer that directly, but the long silence that followed held something very close to quiet agreement. It was 2 nights later, well past the hour most of the clan had settled to sleep, that the reclaimer system failed catastrophically, all at once, a cascade Mara hadn't predicted because no one had thought to tell her exactly how badly the Hollowbell's deeper, older systems had degraded over 4 decades of patchwork repair. Alarms she didn't recognize began sounding through the corridors in overlapping waves, and the air itself seemed to thin within minutes, the whole ancient ark groaning under decades of accumulated neglect finally catching up with itself all at once, like a debt long deferred finally coming due. Mara ran toward the reclaimer bay on pure instinct, Onai close behind her, bare feet slapping against cold metal, and found Kesh already there ahead of them both, hands moving fast and increasingly desperate over a control panel clearly never built to handle a failure of this scale. Primary lines ruptured, Mara said, scanning the damage with the same fast, practical eye she'd once used to assess the fielder's torn hull. We need to isolate the secondary loop before it floods and takes the whole system down with it. We don't have spare parts for that kind of repair, Kesh said, feathers flattened with rising panic. We never planned for a rupture this large. This system was never meant to fail this way. Then we improvise, Mara said, already moving, already reaching for tools scattered across a nearby workbench. And I need every length of piping you can find in the next 10 minutes. Doesn't matter what it was originally built for. Kesh, get me 2 people who aren't afraid to work with their hands in tight, dark spaces. For the first time since she'd woken aboard the Holobell, Mara heard herself giving clear, fast instructions to people who weren't her crew, weren't even her species, and heard them obey without a single moment's hesitation, simply because the instructions made sense and the moment demanded speed over any question of hierarchy or rank. They worked for 6 straight hours. Mara rebuilt the failed junction from spare parts never designed to fit together, guided more by instinct and stubborn determination than any manual she'd ever studied. Onai ran materials back and forth without pause, fast and entirely fearless despite her age. 2 clan members Mara barely knew by name held the failing pipe steady with their bare hands while she welded a patch she hoped, with everything in her, would hold long enough to matter. When the alarms finally quieted, and the thin, stale air began to clear, the reclaimer bay was full of exhausted, soot-streaked figures, human and Ashvane sitting shoulder to shoulder in a silence that felt, for the very first time since she'd arrived, like something genuinely shared between them rather than something merely, separately, endured. You saved us, Kesh said quietly, looking at Mara with an expression she still couldn't fully read, though it no longer carried any trace of the earlier suspicion. We saved us, Mara said, too tired to feel anything but simple relief. I just happened to know which wires needed twisting together. She meant it as plain, simple fact, nothing more. She didn't yet understand that to Draith, watching silently from the doorway with his sharp eyes narrowed to thin slits, it looked like exactly the proof he had been waiting for, and dreading, in equal measure. Draith moved that same night, while the exhausted clan slept off the long hours spent fighting for the reclaimer bay. Mara woke to Onai's voice outside her door, sharp with a fear she had never once heard from the girl before, not even during the worst of the crisis hours earlier that night. They took him, Onai said, breathless, the moment Mara pulled the door open. Draith and his people. They took Kesh's youngest cousin, the little one, Vel. They took him down to the old binding chamber. Binding chamber? Mara asked, pulling on her boots as fast as her still tired hands would allow. It's where the last fragments of the ladder still live, barely, just enough current to keep the old wiring warm, Onai said, already pulling Mara down the dim corridor by the sleeve. Draith believes if he forces a mind into it, especially a young one, still unformed, still soft and unshaped, he can make it bind again. He believes it will spread outward from there, mind to mind, until we are whole once more. He believes it will finally save us all. That could kill a child, Mara said, cold fear sharpening every one of her senses at once. It might, Onai admitted, voice cracking. Kesh tried to stop him already. Draith's people are stronger, and there were more of them than Kesh could fight alone. They sealed the corridor behind them. They found Kesh at the sealed entrance to the old binding chamber, feathers raised in full, open alarm, throwing themselves uselessly against a lock mechanism never designed to be forced open a second time. He has lost himself entirely to grief, Kesh said when Mara arrived, breathless. He truly, honestly believes this will work. He believes it strongly enough to risk Vel's life proving it, and I cannot make him see any other way forward. Mara studied the sealed door for a long moment. Old, certainly, but not unfamiliar, built on the same basic mechanical logic as half the failing systems she'd spent the last several days repairing throughout the ship. I can get through this, she said, already reaching for a maintenance panel set into the wall beside the frame. But I need you to trust me completely for the next 5 minutes, no questions, and I need everyone who isn't directly helping to stay well clear of this door. Kesh didn't hesitate for even a moment. Tell me exactly what to do. While Mara worked the lock, prying at the stubborn panel with hands that shook more than she let show on her face, the arc itself groaned again, deeper this time, a low, grinding sound Mara had learned to fear in the last 6 hours more than any alarm klaxon. A stress fracture somewhere in the old hull, already weakened, widened further by the earlier flooding, finally gave way completely under the accumulated strain. A new klaxon began to wail, different in pitch from the reclaimer alarm, a sound that needed no translation device to understand. Hull breach. We don't have 5 minutes left to spare, Kesh said, voice tight with new urgency. Then we don't need them, Mara said, and wrenched the stubborn panel free with one final, desperate pull. The lock released with a shudder. The heavy door slid open at last. Inside, Draith stood over a small, frightened form pressed hard against a wall lined with old, dark wiring that pulsed faintly, the last dying trace of a mind that had once held 1,000 separate thoughts joined together as one. Stop, Kesh said, voice breaking completely on the single word. Draith turned sharply, his sharp eyes wild with something Mara now recognized, for the first time, not as pure conviction, but as raw, undiluted grief given nowhere else to go. I only want us whole again, Draith said, his composure cracking further with every word. I only want it to finally stop hurting, after 40 years of watching my people fade one broken mind at a time. Behind them, the klaxon rose sharply in pitch and urgency. Somewhere deeper in the arc, Mara knew without needing to check, precious air was already beginning to bleed slowly out into the surrounding vacuum, and there was no time left remaining to argue anyone fully out of 40 long years of accumulated pain. Draith, Mara said, stepping carefully but deliberately between him and the terrified child. The ship is breaking apart around us right now, this very moment. Whatever you believe about binding, about the lattice, about what might finally fix your people, none of it will matter at all if everyone aboard this ark dies tonight because we spent the last of our time arguing instead of acting. You could be entirely right about everything you believe, and still lose everyone you're trying so desperately to save. Draith's hands, still gripping tight to Vel's small, trembling shoulders, began, very slowly, to loosen their grip. There was no time left for the argument to finish properly on its own terms. The dying arc decided the ending for all of them instead. Hull breach confirmed, Sector 4, Kesh said, reading a small handheld display with feathers pressed completely flat in open dread. That's the garden bay. That's our primary water storage. If we lose Sector 4 tonight, we lose everything we spent this whole exhausting night working so hard to save. Vel broke free and ran straight into Kesh's waiting arms, shaking violently. Draith stood frozen in place, all the earlier fight gone out of him entirely, replaced by something that looked, more than anything, like shame finally catching up to him. Mara didn't wait for anyone else to tell her what needed to happen next. She simply started doing it, the way she always had, alone on 100 different survey routes where no one else was ever coming to help. Onai, get every able body on this level to the emergency locker, fast. There should be patch kits and sealant meant for whole work, she said, already moving toward the sound of the breach. Kesh, you know this old ship's layout better than anyone still alive aboard it. I need you routing people to the breach by the fastest possible paths, not the paths you'd normally trust with strangers present, the truly fastest ones, whatever the risk. And Draith? Kesh asked, voice suddenly hard as old iron. Mara looked at the older Ashvane, still frozen in place, still visibly shattered by the weight of what he had nearly done to a child in his own grief and desperation. Draith is coming with me, she said firmly. He knows this ship's old systems better than either of us combined. Right now, tonight, that knowledge matters more than anything else that's happened between us. Draith's sharp eyes came up, clearly surprised, clearly wary, uncertain whether he had truly earned the chance she was offering him without hesitation. Why would you trust me with this, after everything? He asked quietly. I don't fully trust you, not yet, Mara said honestly, already moving toward the breach. But I trust that you love your people enough to want them alive more than you want to be proven right tonight. That's enough to work with for now. What happened over the following hour was not a single, unified effort directed calmly by one clear voice from above. It was a dozen small, separate efforts scattered across the failing sector, each person doing exactly what they alone were best suited to do, without waiting for permission, without pausing to seek instruction from any single mind trying to hold every piece together at once. Onai organized supply runs with a speed and quiet confidence no one had ever specifically asked her to demonstrate. Kesh guided 3 separate teams through dark corridors, only they remembered clearly enough to navigate blind. Draith, working directly beside Mara at the widening breach itself, proved to have hands as steady and clever as any trained engineer Mara had ever worked alongside. guilt slowly burning off into pure, focused, necessary effort. And Mara, standing at the rough center of it all, gave almost no order that wasn't immediately questioned, adjusted, or quietly improved upon by someone else's better idea offered without hesitation. It didn't look anything like the old lattice Kesh had once described to her, a single mind directing 1,000 obedient hands toward one fixed outcome. It looked instead like 1,000 separate minds choosing, again and again, moment by moment, to move toward the exact same goal together, without ever losing themselves entirely in the process of getting there. They sealed the breach at last just as the Ark's remaining reserve air had begun to thin dangerously, Draither's steady hands and Mara's working the final weld side by side, neither one leading the other, both simply doing what plainly needed doing in that moment. When the seal finally held, when the alarms fell blessedly silent one by one, the exhausted group left standing in Sector 4 looked around at each other in the low green light, and for a long, suspended moment, no one spoke at all. "We did that," Onai finally said, breaking the silence, wonder plain and open in her young voice. "Nobody told us exactly how. We just did it together, each finding our own part." Draith, streaked head to foot with grime and old, unresolved grief, looked down at his own hands like he was seeing them clearly for the very first time in years. "Unbound," he said quietly, almost to himself, "and still entirely together. I did not believe that combination was truly possible, not after everything we lost." "It's not a trick, and it's not a secret," Mara said gently, resting a tired hand briefly on his shoulder. "It's just people, choosing each other freely. All of you were always capable of exactly this. You simply needed a real reason to try it without waiting first for someone else's permission." In the days that followed the breach, something in the hollow bell began, slowly and carefully, to shift. Draith did not disappear in shame, though for a while Mara worried he might try to. Instead, haltingly at first and then with growing steadiness, he began spending time in the garden bay alongside Mara and Onai, hands deep in soil he'd once dismissed as beneath his notice, learning the same patient lessons Onai had learned weeks before. "I built my whole life around the belief that alone meant broken," he admitted one quiet afternoon, watching a bin seedling he'd planted himself push its first small leaves toward the light. "I could not separate the two ideas in my mind. Losing the lattice felt, to me, exactly like losing the right to be whole at all." "And now?" Mara asked, not looking up from her own work. "Now I have watched a child grow a plant from nothing, alone, without help, without permission from anyone," Draith said slowly. "And I have watched an entire sector of this ship saved by a dozen minds choosing, separately, to move as one without ever losing themselves in the choosing. I am beginning to understand that I had the two ideas backward all along." Kesh, for their part, began quietly dismantling the old binding chamber, piece by piece, not in anger, but with something closer to gentle, deliberate closure. The old wiring was carefully removed, catalogued, repurposed into the reclaimer system Mara and Kesh continued refining together each evening. What remained of the room, once emptied, became something new entirely, a quiet space for reflection, its walls left bare and honest. "We do not need to erase what the lattice was to us," Kesh explained, setting the last coil of old wiring aside. "We only need to stop mistaking its absence for our own emptiness. Those are different lessons, and I think we needed you here to finally learn the difference." Onai's small garden plot, meanwhile, had grown into something genuinely impressive. 3 neat rows of beans climbing carefully rigged trellises, a scatter of sunflowers just beginning to show their first tight, green buds. She tended it every morning before her other duties, alone, without being asked, without anyone checking her progress. "They're going to bloom soon," Onai reported proudly one morning, showing Mara the tightly furled buds. "I looked it up in the old records. Sunflowers turn to follow the light, all through the day, every single day, without anyone telling them to." "They do," Mara agreed, smiling. "It's just what they are. Nobody has to remind them." "I think," Onai said carefully, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud, "that's what Kesh means, when Kesh talks about you. About us, now, too. We don't need reminding anymore either." Word of the reclaimer repair, the garden bay's steady growth, and the sealed breach spread quietly through the rest of the clan over those following weeks, and with it came a slow, cautious shift in how Mara was regarded throughout the hollow bell. The wary distance she'd first encountered eased, gradually, into something closer to easy familiarity, clan members nodding to her in the corridors, sharing meals without formal invitation, asking her opinion on small repairs without any trace of the earlier suspicion. Draither's proposal to study her, to treat her as some rare key waiting to be extracted, was quietly, permanently withdrawn before the full council ever formally convened to consider it. 3 weeks after that night in Sector 4, a human search vessel finally traced the faint drift trail from Mara's shuttle to the edge of the rift belt, and requested permission to approach the hollow bell directly. By then, the Ark looked, and felt, like a genuinely different place than the one Mara had first woken aboard. The reclaimer system ran clean now, built on a redesigned Mara and Kesh had refined together over long evenings. The garden bay had more than tripled its yield, rows of pale seedlings replaced by tall, healthy green growth standing proud under carefully rebalanced light strips. And the old binding chamber, at Draither's own quiet insistence, had been fully repurposed at last, not out of fear anymore, but out of something closer to hard-won peace. Draither himself had changed the most, in ways Mara suspected would keep settling and deepening for years to come, long after she was gone. He still grieved the lattice, and likely always would. But he no longer measured his people's survival by how completely they might someday rebuild what was lost. He had started instead, quietly, teaching the youngest clan members what he now called standing alone without falling, small daily exercises in independent choice-making that Mara recognized, with quiet private amusement, as remarkably close to how her own mother had once raised her, one small decision at a time. "You could have simply left us to work all of this out entirely on our own," Kesh said, walking beside Mara toward the docking bay where the human search ship now waited, its running lights visible even through the hollow bell's old, scratched viewports. "Once the immediate crisis had passed. Once you knew for certain we would survive without you here. Most in your position would have." "I don't know how to leave something unfinished behind me," Mara said, matching Kesh's slower pace. "It's not really a conscious choice on my part, most days. It's simply how I'm built, all the way down." Onai waited near the airlock, holding something carefully cradled in both hands. A small clay pot, packed with dark, rich soil, and rising from its center, a single green shoot, thin but visibly strong, reaching steadily toward the overhead light strips. "It grew," Onai said, holding it out proudly. "Just like you told me it would, all those weeks ago. Even though I was scared, some days, that it wouldn't. Even though nobody ever told me exactly how it was supposed to happen." Mara knelt down and studied the small plant for a long, quiet moment, feeling something warm settle deep in her chest. "That's the whole secret, really," she said. "It doesn't need anyone's permission to grow. It just needs you to trust it enough to keep trying, day after day, even without proof it'll work." "Will you take it with you?" Onai asked. "Back to your own people, wherever they are." Mara shook her head gently, closing Onai's small fingers back around the pot with careful hands. "No," she said. "You keep this one. Grow more from it, whenever you're ready. Plant them everywhere you possibly can, even in the places aboard this ship that still seem too broken or too forgotten for anything to grow there. Especially those places, if you can manage it." Kesh stepped forward then and offered something else entirely, a small woven cord, patterned carefully in the rust and grey colors of the clan, tied off in a simple, deliberate knot that had clearly taken real time and care to finish. "For remembering," Kesh said, placing it gently in Mara's open palm. "That being whole and being alone were never truly opposites, whatever we once believed. We did not fully understand that difference before you fell out of our sky and into our lives. I do not believe we will forget it again, not after everything this ship has survived because of it." Mara took the small cord and tied it carefully around her wrist, just beside her worn watch strap, a strange, small bracelet built from two entirely different worlds finally meeting in one quiet place. At the airlock, before stepping through into the waiting docking tube, she turned back one final time, and found herself smiling the same small, calm smile the human rescue crew would later find so strange when they finally reached her, except this time, there was no mystery left in it at all, not for her. She had been alone in the dark once, freezing, certain no one was coming for her, and she had smiled anyway, because some steady part of her had already known, even then, that whatever happened next, she would still be entirely whole. Now, standing at the edge of two worlds, she finally understood the other half of that same truth, the half she hadn't fully known to look for on that frozen night out in the Rift Belt. Being whole on your own was never really the end of the story, she realized. It was only ever the beginning of being free to choose, without pressure or fear, exactly who you wanted standing quietly beside you. Behind her, in the garden bay of the Hollow Bell, 100 small green shoots reached steadily upward toward the light, planted by hands that had finally learned together and separately, that they never once needed anyone's permission to grow. They had only ever needed the plain, simple courage to begin.